Hey class, today we're covering deep ecology by way of Arne Næss. And also too, interestingly enough, we're looking at the ways in which we're understanding deep ecology on the top of Lookout Mountain. So I'm on Lookout Mountain right now, which I thought would be appropriate. And it's also a weekday, so it's relatively quiet, thank goodness. So there's not a lot of people looking at Lookout Mountain today. And so we're looking at Arne Næss, who was a Norwegian philosopher who was born in 1912 and dies in 2009. So he's a 20th century philosopher who develops deep ecology. And also too, I have as a side note that he was influenced by Rachel Carson, whom we looked at just a little bit earlier at the beginning of the semester as a primary influence on his work in deep ecology. And Aldo Leopold is also a precursor in terms of an influence for Arne Næss. So we see shades of both in how it is that we understand deep ecology as a whole. And so Arne Næss is a 20th century philosopher who developed deep ecology, and I have you reading an entry in deep ecology from the Encyclopedia of Environmental Ethics, and the philosophy thereof. And in the entry we have an interesting quote. So deep ecologists, they write, quote, "Deep ecologists argue that as environmental philosophers, we must recognize the values that inhere objectively in nature, independently of human wants and needs or desires." And so what I always tell classes there is that if I were the editor there, I would stop the author and note that we need to see this not as independently, we need to see ourselves as independent from nature, but we need to see ourselves as interdependent. So if we see ourselves as separate, then the problem is that we're committing this problem where we're not recognizing our own dependency and likewise our own involvement on planet Earth and the universe as a whole. So we need to change that independence to interdependence, okay? So it would be better framed as interdependency. And still, the strong sense of a deep ecologist is obviously extending into a discussion about anthropocentrism. In other words, anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism. In other words, we're wanting to recognize that as a deep ecologist, we are non-anthropocentric. In other words, we don't see ourselves as the center of the universe. We're seeing ourselves as merely a part of the universe, okay? And we see this, the earth and nature and the universe as having intrinsic value beyond our own needs, wants, and desires. So yet, simultaneously, we need to see that we are also a part of the whole indeed. So a deep ecologist is working to develop a holistic view of their ethical outlook within nature and in relation to each other. So this holistic view then is a clear extension of Næss's influence from Baruch Spinoza, okay? And there's also overlap with our reference and study of the land ethic with Aldo Leopold, and likewise Rachel Carson. So we see that for Arne Næss and also the American philosopher George Sessions, who was born in 1938 and died in 2016, who is also who also assisted Arne Næss in the development of deep ecology. And so back in the early 1970s. So the term has to do with a radical approach to ecology. And so the views of a deep ecologist are radical in the way in which we're repositioning our metaphysical outlook to include an ontological framework. So what does that mean? So in metaphysics, we're looking at the way in which we're thinking about ourselves in relation to part of the whole. And so when you're looking at parts and wholes relationship, you're seeing that as inherently metaphysical, just like we did with Spinoza. And then also, too, we want to see that seeing our relationship to the world as in this part-whole relationship, we're also establishing how we're understanding ourselves in terms of being as well. In other words, our very existence is reliant on this relationship in an interdependent, reciprocal way. Okay, so similar to what we were looking at with Arne Næss by way of symbiosis. So remember his emphasis there. And likewise, that we are just simply a part of God or part of the one substance with Spinoza. This is similar. So, in other words, of course, the views of the deep ecologist are contrasted with the views of a shallow ecologist, whereby a shallow ecologist usually is focused in a reactionary way with his or her concern for recycling, emissions control, and likewise seeing ourselves as separate from the environment. Okay, so that goes hand in hand when we say we are not part of nature. We are actually, all of our efforts as humans are artificial in relation to nature. All of that is something that we're calling into question here to see our relationship as interdependent. We are not separate from nature. We are a part of nature because nature provides us with resources. And so when we're just focused on nature from a shallow ecologist point of view, we're not looking at the causes that bring us to the problems of pollution and emissions, et cetera, okay? So not only are we encouraged to take a metaphysical and ontological view of our relation to nature for Næss, we are also urged to see all of this mutual interdependence as having personal significance and overlap, which is oddly why Næss referenced his philosophy as ecosophy. So ecosophy is a combination of how it is that we're understanding the philosophy of ecology, and the T there is indicative of the very place in which Næss would work in Norway, which is the Tvergstein hut that he worked at in Norway. So he had this retreat on a mountainside in Tvergstein, Norway. That's where he worked. And that's also where he establishes his connection with the environment to be a way in which we are understanding ourselves in a particular position in space-time. So in other words, our particular position in the way in which we're establishing our own ethical practice and framework is just as important as establishing that perspective. So that's the importance there. So in other words, the intrinsic value we place on nature is not just for the sake of nature, but to also understand our relation and dependency with nature, intrinsically rather than simply instrumentally. And so let's turn to Næss's essay from 1972, The Shallow and the Deep, a long-range ecology movement, a summary. So that's also what I'm having you read. So first we'll recognize that Næss refers to his shallow ecology movement, the shallow ecology movement, which is reactionary and usually only framed in the way that we think we're taking apart environmentally in terms of our central objectives having to do with an anthropocentric view of health and affluence. So this also is a way in which we're understanding ourselves anthropocentrically in terms of fighting pollution and the problems of emission control with reference to resource depletion, et cetera, as merely reactionary. And so this is a typical way in which we view our environmental responsibility, and this is a way that we're trying to dislodge ourselves from this perspective as being something that's merely reactionary and not looking at the causes of those problems. And so in the subchapter titled Deep Ecology, here we have highlighted our goal is to embrace and value what he calls total field image, with a value of feeling and identifying an ethical framework of mind in terms of relations. So in other words, we are relational as we are ethical, and we also feel these relations. In other words, if we think of a relation between two things, A and B, we have to recognize that the unification of those two elements becomes more of what those two things are separately. So in other words, our relation to the environment is something more than just a relation. It also brings about a whole new understanding of our ethical framework. So then for number 2, which is what Arne Næss refers to as biospherical egalitarianism, here we're working to develop the equal right in the name of all creatures, with the caveat that some killing is still necessary. So in other words, we still have to have a sense of how it is that we are understanding our relationship in terms of equality. And here is where we're wanting to let go of the dominant mindset to the environment as external in valuing relations of life in and of itself, not just to what we can take from life, okay? And then so the issues of overpopulation, of people, the issues of overpopulation of people and mammals and animals depends on the great concern for our own well-being as well, and their well-being, a concern for our well-being as well as a concern for the well-being of others. And so number 3, with the subchapter Principles of Diversity and Symbiosis, Næss wishes to emphasize multiplicity and diversity. And so with this outlook, we have the primacy and importance of emphasizing diversity, not only of plants and animals, but also in light of culture and community as well. So in other words, the multiplicity and diversity also has to do with the way in which we're understanding our own culture, and likewise the way in which we're understanding our community is likewise a relation to nature as well. So it's not just how it is that we're viewing our actions apart from our community, it also has to do with how it is that we're thinking of our actions within a community, a larger culture, and how that community and culture also are in relation to the environment. And so 4, with Næss's view in the subchapter 4, we have what's called the anti-class posture. And so with the anti-class posture, Næss points out that with the problems of exploitation and the exploiter is compromised in terms of their potentialities of self-realization as well. So in other words, we usually think of exploitation as the problem of the exploited, right? But we forget too that the person who is doing the exploiting also is compromised in terms of their own potential, right? And so here also Næss sees earlier points of biospherical egalitarianism tying into principles of diversity, which also tie into principles of symbiosis. And again, we remind ourselves that with symbiosis, we're also seeing a connection to Arne Næss and Arne Næss's influence on deep ecology, or the deep ecology movement. And we see this all as overlapping. And of course it needs to overlap, given that all of this is a part of the whole relationship. And so, in other words, to avoid hierarchical competitive modes we fall into, we need to call into question those hierarchies in order to see that there is this emphasis, or try to work at establishing an emphasis where we're not focused on the hierarchies, we're rather focusing on the interdependence of our relations as well. And then with 5, this is another stab at what we're characterizing as the fight against pollution and resource depletion, whereby these goals also bring about problems of other kinds that get in the way of the livelihoods of people. So whenever we're overlooking our own holistic relations in terms of resource depletion and recycling. So in other words, recycling and attacking resource depletion and emissions control could also get in our way of how it is that we're understanding our relations with other people, and likewise the intrinsic relation to the planet, because we could be ignoring the causes, the root causes of those problems as well. And so add to these issues, Næss includes in the subchapter, Næss includes the subchapter complexity, not complication, where, as Næss points out, quote, a multiplicity of rare or less lawful interacting factors may operate together to form a unity. A multiplicity of more or less lawful interacting factors may operate together to form a unity. So in other words, the more or less lawful interacting factors are the ways in which we are understanding ourselves in multiple ways that are not to distract us and to say, well, we're all different, but rather to say, where is it that we could come together in spite of our differences? Or within our differences, what are things that we also share in common, right? And so this is still necessary to recognize the whole of ourselves and also the way in which we are working within a system as well. And then so with local autonomy and decentralization, which is point 7, here we are wanting to embrace less of a top-down and more of a bottom-up mindset to our environmental problems, emphasizing the way in which we think environmentally as we need to think locally in order to act globally. We've heard that before. And so the deep ecologist is not just logical and reasonable, they also place value on the normative value of our relations. In other words, the ethical value of our relations that already are helped by a vast amount of people. That in other words, there's a sense of how it is that we understand ourselves objectively and also in ethical relations with each other. All we need to do is extend that over to how it is that we're thinking of the importance of the environment, which is a point that Leopold was making as well. In other words, yes, we have ethics, but do we have a land ethic, right? And then so, of course, we're not just thinking of this as beyond just a reaction to resource depletion and pollution management, right? So ecosophy is a philosophy and whereby we are drawing our sense of an equilibrium with holistic wisdom and also prescriptives and also emotional descriptives. In other words, an emotional relationship that is normative and conscientious in terms of our interdependency with the environment, that tie into our scientific know-how. And so deep ecologists see not just the facts, but also the values that inhere in our relation to the environment in a way that is accordance with deep ecology, according to Arne Næss, also Aldo Leopold, Rachel Carson, and so forth. So thank you. And I'm glad I could share this with you and also have this interesting place to record our field recording. And so thank you again and have a fantastic day.